It began when I joined the WCF's Golf Croquet Rules Committee in January 2017 as the Croquet Association's representative, and worked on the 5th edition and became the editor for the committee. And I continued that role for the 6th edition when I began my second 4-year term starting in January of 2021. The role of the editor is to be the wordsmith, basically to express as clearly as one can the decisions of the committee in relation to the substantive meaning of the rules. It was very important that we took a good look at the words used to try and make them as clear as possible, because players and referees shouldn't have to puzzle over either meaning or the purpose of a rule. And also, we took great care to try and ensure that we expressed the same idea in exactly the same language in different parts of the rules. Well, there were 3 reasons which were relevant. The first was that the 5th edition had made some significant changes. And although we thought it was a good document and it greatly reduced the number of queries that players and referees had about the rules, nonetheless, it became evident as people gained experience with the 5th edition that there were still some gaps that needed addressing by publishing official rulings. So one reason was to incorporate those official rulings in the body of the rules. The second, we did recognize that although we felt we had improved the wrong ball rule, Rule 10, it was still the one that players found difficult to understand. And making sure that as golf croquet continues to grow and attract new players, this particular rule should be expressed as clearly as possible. And we found a way to do that. And lastly, the World Croquet Federation is very keen that the AC laws and GC rules should deal with common areas in exactly the same way as far as possible. And the most obvious example is the fault law in AC and the fault rule in GC. Referees frequently referee in both codes, and it's clearly sensible that they should apply the same standards and be looking for the same things, irrespective of which particular code they're refereeing in at the moment. The basic rules and tactics of both level play GC and the traditional form of handicap GC have not changed in any way. The only actual rule changes in the 6th edition involve swapping the order of rules 17 and 18 and adding 2 new rules to cover time-limited games and a new form of handicap play called advantage golf croquet. Also, the glossary has been expanded to use more defined terms, which are intended to make the rules shorter and easier to use. And as I said earlier, the text of the rules has been reviewed carefully, and it has been refreshed in certain places to say the same things more clearly, and a few rare situations are now covered for the first time or in a slightly different way. The idea of doing away with extra strokes and altering the starting scores for the 2 sides should be credited to the Irish golf croquet players. They thought of it about 8 years ago and enjoyed playing it. And news filtered through to the WCF about 3 years ago. And it was decided that this was well worth looking into more deeply. It was trialed unofficially in places like Germany and in Latvia. And a working group was set up, which included some very strong mathematical input to try and get the most fair starting scores that you could, depending on people's handicaps. And it was then officially trialed in the Croquet Association's Southern Federation in the summer of 2021. And although some tweaks to the starting scores were felt to be desirable, the basic concept was regarded as being attractive and successful. And so the WCF decided they wanted to have an official rule in the new rules book, so it had the status of an authorized variation. So what you do in practice, you go and look at the starting scores table, which is available on the WCF website, and the link is provided in Rule 21. Players are encouraged to print out a copy and carry it around with them, and clubs will be encouraged to print out an even larger form, which they can put up on a notice board. And so players about to play a game of Advantage GC can just check each other's handicaps, go and look at the table and see what the two starting scores should be. What it means is that the weaker player will have to win fewer than 7 hoops to win a standard game, and their opponent might have to win more than 7 hoops. And it's this difference in the hurdle the two sides have to jump, which makes for a more equal game. And statistics will be collected for several years to come, and we may have to refine the start scores in the future, but they're now available for a best of 7 game, or a best of 13 game, or a best of 19 game. But these are referred to in Advantage GC as first to 4 points, first to 7 points, and first to 10 points. The only one is that the sides have to be extremely clear about the score after each hoop. Now, Rule 7.8 already requires the side for which a point is scored to say what the score now is. Players don't always do it. They just put on a scoring clip. But in Advantage GC, it will be very much encouraged that the new score is stated loudly so that both sides know exactly where they are. So if a game started off, shall we say, -2 +2, and the stronger player won the first hoop, then they would say it's -1 +2. And if they won the second hoop, they'd say it's 0 +2. And then if the weaker player won the next one, it would be 0-3. And so the score would be stated as clearly as possible after every hoop. And there may well be devices for making it possible to keep track by using special clips, but I think the best way will be the players realizing the obligation and getting used to stating the score after each hoop has been scored so that both sides know exactly what the position is. Rule 17 now deals with penalty areas and penalty area continuation, and Rule 18 covers alternative colours and double banking. Rule 19 is the new rule dealing with time-limited games, but UK players will see no change at all because this rule has the same default approach as that used in the CA's tournament regulations. Handicap play of the traditional type is now covered in Rule 20, and Rule 21 describes Advantage GC. And what this arrangement means is that the standard game of single-banked, untimed, level golf croquet is now covered exclusively by Rules 1 to 17. And the later rules, 18 to 21, only apply when one of the variations is in use. And obviously, 2 of them, double banking and time limits, are very common. I should say that the slight differences in the wording in the time limit rule, but if you look carefully, you'll see it says exactly the same thing as we're all used to in this country. And in particular, when the last turn occurs is defined as before by when the last stroke is played. So if you make your mallet hit the ball and time then expires, then that turn is the last turn for the purpose of that game and determining whether or not there's an extension period to play, and if there is, who will play the first stroke of that extension period. Yes, what's happened there is that we've, again, clarified rules 9.1 and 9.2, but we've realized that one unintended difference between the AC laws and the GC rules was the treatment of a player being misled by their opponent supplying incorrect information. And that's always been a species of interference in the AC laws. And we agree that it should be one in the GC rules as well. So what was Rule 14.1.2 is now Rule 9.6. And this actually also allows time to be restored should there be some form of problem right before the expiry of a time limit. An impasse is something which doesn't happen very often in golf croquet, but sometimes one side will play a ball which rests very closely in contact or even touching an opponent ball, and that on its own wouldn't lead to any great problems because the other two balls are free to contest a hoop, and that would lead to one of the sides playing one of those two balls in contact away. However, you can have a situation when both pairs of balls are in this deadlocked situation, and then you can have neither side being prepared to be the first one to play away and, in their eyes, perhaps give the other side an advantage. So you get a succession of players deeming strokes or playing very tiny strokes that don't change the situation at all. Now, if that happens, what was being done by most referees informally was simply to apply a penalty area continuation. And that's now been enshrined in Rule 15.3 as the correct way to resolve this situation. The referee will actually be called, possibly by the striker, possibly by the players acting together, and will warn them that he will watch the game for the next 2 rotations, the next 8 turns, and if nothing has changed in that time, he will then be likely to declare an impasse, and they will then have to go into the penalty area continuation procedure in Rule 17.2. Rule 6.3, which defines a stroke, has been reorganized and contains new material dealing with some rare situations, including annulment. Rule 6.4 now provides a much more comprehensive treatment of when a ball becomes an outside agency and when it ceases to be an outside agency. Rule 7, which deals with scoring a point, has been brought into line as much as possible with the approach of the AC laws. And I think Rule 7.9 should be highlighted here. This deals with when the players contest or run a hoop out of order. Now, in the interest of continuity and speed of play, if a player realizes what has happened, they're entitled now to wait until their opponent has played one more stroke and then forestall, adjust the score if necessary, and then they can be the first to play to the correct hoop. However, a common instance is when an inactive referee who is watching the game sees that the players have gone out of order, and then if they see that both sides have gone for the wrong hoop, then they should forestall play, but in the interest of balance, the game is restarted by a penalty area continuation. Rule 8 should be mentioned. This deals with offside balls and could also give rise to 1 or 2 queries. We've included in the glossary the new term offside direction, which is a term people often use in play. And this has allowed us to present the rule in a somewhat crisper and shorter fashion, which we hope will be clearer. But it hasn't changed except for one area. We recognize a rare case where a ball is resting very close to a halfway line for the next hoop, but 1 to be scored, but the current hoop still hasn't been resolved. Now, if an outside agency or even an opponent disturbs that ball, interferes with it, and there's doubt about where it should be replaced, Rule 8.2.3 stipulates that it should be put back in accordance with Rule 9.2, which is dealing with interference by an outside agency, but that ball will not be treated as offside if a point is scored before it is next played. It's just a fair way of resolving an otherwise possible source of argument when one side says, I'm sure it was potentially offside, and the other one says, no, it wasn't. So now we say, you put it back where you think it was, but it won't be offside if it isn't played again before the next point is scored. Obviously, if there's more rotations, it'll be played from that position and everything will be normal. But we have seen that particular situation crop up and it's now dealt with. This rule has been reorganized and shortened. It contains the rule about impasses we mentioned earlier at 15.3, and it contains the rule about a referee intervening when they see the sides going out of order or contesting the wrong hoop, and that's at 15.4. And of course, it also contains that very important catch-all, the overriding rule, as rule 15.5. And that's there to deal with the most unlikely situations, which you wouldn't want to clutter up the text of the rules by having special provisions for very unlikely things. But if something which the rules don't seem to cover properly does happen, then you call a referee, and the referee will apply a solution which is equitable, which best meets the justice of the case, to use the words of Rule 15.5. And on that tack, we've clarified the powers of a referee in Rule 16 to deal with what we hope is a very rare eventuality, which is players breaching Rule 16.1, which demands good behavior, on more than one occasion. And then they have a series of increasing penalties that they can apply, with ultimately the threat of going to the tournament referee and recommending that a player be disqualified. I sincerely hope that will never have to be used, but we felt it was important to give referees a full range of powers should they need them. Rule 10, as I mentioned earlier, probably gets more queries than any other, and this has been reordered to make it much easier to use. 10.1 defines a wrong ball in simple terms, in terms of anything covered by rules 10.3 to 10.5. Rule 10.2 deals with forestalling play in more detail than was the case in the 5th edition. It deals both with forestalling before a player has played a wrong ball, which is the most desirable time to do it, so nothing ever actually goes wrong. Or if that's not noticed, you forestall immediately after someone's played a wrong ball, if you then realize that they have gone wrong. 10.3 to 10.5 describe the only 3 types of wrong ball that can actually happen. And they're ordered with the least common first, so they can be used as a checklist. You start with 10.3, you see if that applies, and if not, you go to 10.4. If that doesn't apply, you move on to 10.5. Which is where 99% of all wrong ball cases end up. 10.3 is playing when not entitled, and it replaces the 5th edition rule, which dealt with a side playing successive strokes. It covers that situation, but it also covers others as well, because you could have a situation where perhaps one player was going to play first, but for some strange reason, his opponent played a shot. Well, what 10.3 allows the players to do is to annul the shot that was played wrongly, which means it's cancelled, it's treated as if it never happened, and then the game goes back to where it should have been and can continue normally. Another example would be if it was agreed that a player had played a wrong ball and the replace and replay remedy was to be applied. So the same player would be playing again, and then someone goes off beam and the other side plays a stroke. Well, again, they shouldn't have played, they weren't entitled to. So again, that stroke can be annulled, and then the game can be put back to where it should have been and can continue normally. So annulling is a new remedy which has limited application, but it's very useful when it can be applied. Now, 10.4 is exactly the same as the equivalent rule in the 5th edition, and that's the one called previous stroke played with opponent ball. And this is a situation where, as can happen, one side plays an opponent ball. And what happens almost all the time is that the owner of the ball wakes up to that and protests. And then under these rules, and indeed under the 5th edition, the remedy is just to replace and replay. However, it's possible that, particularly in doubles, that the side whose ball has been played wrongly might not notice and might play a stroke. And if you think about how we define the striker's ball and the striker, you soon realize you're in a logical impossibility. So the solution is to apply a penalty area continuation. and that remains exactly the same under the 6th edition. 10.5 is the biggie. It's when the striker's side plays a wrong ball, and the most common version is, of course, where they play the partner ball, and that can be either in singles or in doubles. And that is the error which is the most common and attracts the choice of either replace and replay or ball swap. The other two types of this class of error are when the striker's side plays the opponent ball, which we've just discussed in the context of 10.4. The remedy is just replace and replay. And the third is when in doubles, the striker's partner plays the striker's ball. So the correct ball has been played, but by the wrong player. And then again, the remedy is just replace and replay. 10.6 and 10.7 are two housekeeping rules. 10.6 deals with the status of any earlier strokes and points once a wrong ball has been discovered. And that now deals with all three types of wrong ball, whereas the 5th edition concentrated only on the wrong ball played by the striker's side. And lastly, 10.7 provides a detailed statement of what happens if a stroke is played which is a wrong ball and also constitutes a fault. And except for 10.3 and 10.4, which have their own remedies and therefore they cause the fault to be ignored, in the case of a striker's side error, then the wrong ball is ignored and the fault is remedied, and play continues by the opposing side playing the ball after the one which should have been played in the previous stroke. So that is the new Rule 10. I hope very much that players will find it clearer and more logical, and we'll see even fewer queries about that than we did in the 5th edition. In the 5th edition, there was a special rule for a wrong ball committed in those first 4 turns, and the game was simply restarted. But when we thought about it, it doesn't happen very often because normally the players are concentrating and they play the balls in the correct sequence. And if it did happen, the existing rules are perfectly capable of taking care of it. The only exception to that is the rare case where the players swap colours at the start of the 2nd or 3rd game of a match and don't realise that they've done that for several turns. Now, in that case, they're simply allowed to continue with the swapped colours, but that's no change from the situation in the 5th edition. The rules are quite clear. They limit the obligation to forestall, and indeed the right to forestall, to the players of the game and to a referee if present, which would normally refer to a referee in charge, which is very rarely seen in England these days, or to a referee who is active and realizes that the player is about to play a wrong ball and is entitled to forestall at that point. And lastly, it can be the inactive referee that we discussed earlier, someone who is watching play and realizes that the players are about to go out of sequence or have just done so. Now, it's important to stress that an inactive referee is someone who is not merely a qualified referee, but has also been authorized by the tournament referee to act as a referee in that match or event. It's not any person who happens to have a refereeing qualification. Now, having said all that, a very sensible adaptation was brought in by the Croquet Association to allow tournament referees to appoint the players of an event as sequence umpires, which is basically a domestic refereeing title, which allows the players to step in. And of course, with double banking being so common, double bankers may well be in a position to put the other players right if they see them about to go wrong. The first question was whether the winner of the toss should have the right to play first or second, instead of simply being forced to play first and to play blue. And the second question was whether the wrong ball remedies should be extended in two cases, namely playing an opponent ball or when the striker's partner plays the striker's ball in doubles. It's fair to say there wasn't a huge reaction to either question, and of the responses we got, opinion was fairly evenly divided. Nonetheless, in response to the first question, the WCF Rules Committee could see no harm in acceding to the request. It makes the situation the same as in association croquet, and it also restores the position to what it was for the first and second editions of the GC rules. It has the emotional appeal that if you win the toss, you then have the power to decide in doubles in particular to play second so that you can see which of your opponents are going to play blue, and then you can make sure you play the person you want on your side to play red. It makes no difference to the odds, of course. They remain at 50%. The other question, which related to should we extend the wrong ball penalties, we decided that that would not be a good idea. It was commented it might influence some players to be less keen to forestall before a wrong ball is played, to see what the options might be. And that is not something that we regard as a desirable outcome. So replace and replay remain the two remedies for those two errors. And it's up to the opponent to be on the ball, and if they see that their ball is about to be played, they should speak up and prevent it happening. And likewise, in the fairly rare case of the wrong member of a side about to play the striker's ball, again, it's in their interest to say, stop, your partner's meant to play that, not you. So we're pleased we did the consultation, but we're equally confident we've taken the right course in response to the replies.